Okay. How's everybody doing? That's good. Good to see everybody again. But yes, we are continuing in the book of Exodus. And honestly, this is actually, to me, like one of the main chapters. And to me, this is kind of what we've been building up towards. And one of the main reasons why I even chose this book to begin with. But with that, let me really pray for us very quickly, and we'll get into the Word. Father, we pray, Lord, that you would speak to us, that your words would be true, that they would fall on fresh, fertile soils. We just pray, Lord, that you would remove anything that would keep us from hearing your word today. We thank you and we praise you in the name of Jesus. Amen. So I call this the first festival. And before we get into this, the question I want to ask you is, and I do this all the time, but do you ever really think about the meaning of holidays? Right? What's the next big holiday that's coming here in Korea? Chuseok, right? What is Chuseok?
Thanksgiving.
But what is it really? What was the significance behind it? It's a fall harvest, right? Now for us, we don't farm anymore. So we lose that significance, right? For the fall harvest was a big deal because this was the last of the crop. And if you had a lot, then you had a lot to be thankful for. Because this would carry you in through the winter, right? So this was there was a reason why you were thankful was because God had provided enough for you that you could survive until the spring, right? That's the significance of a fall harvest. But for us, what is Chuseok? Okay, so there's what is that? What's that? Songpyeon? What was that? Songpyeon. The sesame seed and the honey, right? So there's like some of us think of different food for Chuseok. What else do you think about for Chuseok? Yeah, it's a day off, right? It's actually more than it's like 3 days off, right? But this year it's insane. This year it's like a week and a half because it's connected to another holiday. So this year is crazy, right? So I think people are really excited this year. But for us, like, we don't really think about the meanings of holidays anymore because a lot of the significance behind it is gone. Right? We're no longer a farming community. So a spring or a fall harvest doesn't make that big of a deal to us. And for us, like holidays like Christmas, Christmas in Korea is very depressing. I guess as a single guy too. But Christmas is not, it's not a family holiday, right? It's actually a couple holiday, which is very strange. For those of you that are new to Korea, there are many couple holidays. There's Valentine's, White Day, Pepero Day, Christmas. Am I missing any? We could throw in Black Day just for the heck of it. But anyway, there's a lot of like quote unquote holidays that have to do with your marital status, right? But for us, a lot of the holidays that should be significant, we kind of lose the meaning behind it. And so today we're actually going to be looking at a very significant holiday or festival for the Israelites. And how, even in the way that they were taught to practice it, it was meant to continually teach them the meaning and depth behind that. So just keep that in the back of your heads. Whenever you have a holiday coming up, really think about, well, what does God really want me to reflect upon during the season? So with that, let's go to Exodus 12. Open your Bible, smartphones, look at the screen. Exodus 12, starting from verse 1, the word Lord says this. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in Egypt, "This month is to be for you the first month of your year. Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. If any household is too small for a whole lamb, they must share one with their near neighbor, having taken into account the number of people there are. You are to determine the amount of lamb needed in accordance with what each person will eat. The animal you choose must be year-old males without defect, and you may take them from the sheep or the goats. Take care of them until the 14th day of the month, when all the members of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight. Then they are to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of the houses where they eat the lamb. That same night they are to eat the meat roasted over the fire along with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast. Do not eat the meat raw or boiled in water, but roasted over a fire with the head, legs, and internal organs. Do not leave any of it till morning. If some of it is left till morning, you must burn it.
This is how you are to eat it, with your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. On that same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. This is a day you are to commemorate. For the generations to come, you shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord, a lasting ordinance. For 7 days you are to eat bread made without yeast. On the first day, remove the yeast from your houses, for whoever eats anything with yeast in it from the first day through the seventh must be cut off from Israel. On the first day, hold a sacred assembly, and another one on the seventh day. Do not work at all on these days, except to prepare food for everyone to eat. That is all you may do. Celebrate the festival of unleavened bread, because it is on this very day that I brought your divisions out of Egypt. Celebrate this day as a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. In the first month you are to eat bread made without yeast, from the evening of the 14th day until the evening of the 21st day. For 7 days no yeast is to be found in your houses, and anyone, whether foreigner or native born, who eats anything with yeast in it must be cut off from the community of Israel. Eat nothing made with yeast. Wherever you live, you must eat unleavened bread. Then Moses summoned all the elders of Israel and said to them, Go at once and select the animals for your families and slaughter the Passover lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop, dip it into the blood in the basin, and put some of the blood on the top and both sides of the door frame. None of you shall go out of the door of your house until morning. When the Lord goes to the land to strike down the Egyptians, he will see the blood on the top and sides of the doorframe, and will pass over that doorway, and he will not permit the destroyer to enter your houses and strike you down. Obey these instructions as a lasting ordinance for you and your descendants. When you enter the land that the Lord will give you, as he promised, observe this ceremony. And when your children ask you, What does this ceremony mean to you? Then tell them, it is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt and spared our homes when he struck down the Egyptians. Then the people bowed down and worshipped. The Israelites did just what the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on the throne to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and the firstborn of all the livestock as well. Pharaoh and all his officials and all the Egyptians got up during the night, and there was loud wailing in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. During the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, Up, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go, worship your Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds as you have said, and go, and also bless me. The Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country, for otherwise, they said, we will all die. So the people took their dough before the yeast was added and carried it on their shoulders in kneading troughs wrapped in clothing. The Israelites did as Moses instructed and asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and for clothing. The Lord had made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, and they gave them what they asked for. So they plundered the Egyptians. The Israelites journeyed from Ramses to Succoth. There were about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. Many other people went up with them, and also large droves of livestock, both flocks and herds. With the dough the Israelites had brought from Egypt, they baked loaves of unleavened bread. The dough was without yeast because they had been driven out of Egypt and did not have time to prepare food for themselves. Now the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of the 430 years, to the very day, all the Lord's divisions left Egypt. Because the Lord kept vigil that night to bring them out of Egypt, on this night all the Israelites are to keep vigil to honor the Lord for the generations to come. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, These are the regulations for the Passover meal. No foreigner may eat it. Any slave you have brought may eat it after you have circumcised them, but a temporary resident or a hired worker may not eat it. It must be eaten inside the house. Take none of it of the meat outside the house. Do not break any of the bones. The whole community of Israel must celebrate it. A foreigner residing among you who wants to celebrate the Lord's Passover must have all the males in his household circumcised. Then he may take part like one born in the land. No uncircumcised male may eat it. The same law applies both to the native born and to the foreigner residing among you. All the Israelites did just what the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron. And on that very day, the Lord brought the Israelites out of Egypt by their divisions. Amen. Long passage, but really there's a very significant message that I want to get to here. But again, our theme for this year is the gospel of freedom. So my hope for us, brothers and sisters, is that we can truly experience through the gospel of Jesus Christ, that we can experience more freedom in our lives. And I'll be touching upon that later today. As we've been going through Exodus, we saw this case of God's people oppressed in slavery. And this man rises up and he fails. But God ends up being the real hero. God raises this man back up, empowers him, encourages him, and uses him. Shows him that I want to be known by my personal name. He gives him the personal name of Yahweh at the burning bush. And shows that he is going to free Israel. And he does it through a series of tremendous and also horrible plagues, which we went through over the past month. But at the end of the day, what he was really showing us there is that when we choose to worship God, it is an all-in concept. When you choose God, it is exclusive. So as we finish up these plagues, what I want to remind us about these plagues is all these horrible things, right? These flies, these gnats, these boils, this hail, locusts, all these crazy things. The purpose behind them was to make the Lord, the God of Israel, known, right? First to his own people, to Israel, but then also to Egypt and Pharaoh. Pharaoh kept mocking, saying, I don't know the Lord. Well, he does now. And as God also said, this is to be for all the world to see. That this was an act that was going to be so tremendous and so great that everyone would know who this God of Israel is. And it would pass through the generations. But ultimately also, God is doing this to keep his promise. That he would free them after 400 years. And that he would lead them eventually to their promised land. And so here we are in the last plague. Now if you guys remember, there was a cycle. Every 3 plagues had a cycle, and now we're on the 10th plague, and this is very different from all the other plagues. And this is the one that ultimately sets them free. Now, this is kind of weird, right? When we get into this chapter, the whole book of Exodus has been a narrative. It's been a story. And then it seems like there's a break in the story where it gives you a lot of detail about a festival. You're like, what? Why are you giving me instructions on a festival when you're telling me a story, right? So it's kind of an unusual break, is that there's a lot of description, and it really seems like it's written in a way for future audiences. That future generations, when they read this, that they would be like, oh, this is why we do this, right? So as we get into that, I want to remind you, all the way back in Exodus 5, when Moses first confronts Pharaoh on his own, he says, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, let my people go so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness. I kind of made fun of that. Right? Because originally, Moses was supposed to say, let my people go so that they can leave on a journey to worship the Lord. Right? But instead he says, hold a festival, yay, we're going to party. But ironically, chapter 12, it's a description of a festival. Right? So, right off the bat, right when we get into this passage, God says, change your calendar, right? This will now be the first month. This is the first month of year. Why is he doing this? So that they will always remember what this is about, right? Now think about it. Let's say like this month is what, August. All of a sudden, God does something crazy in August. He's like, change August to the first month of the year. That would be really confusing, right? Like how old are you now? like especially in Korean age, right? If the year resets in August, that would really mess up a lot of Korean ages. But anyway, change your calendar. God is doing this because he wants the Israelites to remember every single year, to look forward to this every single year in the first month. This is when Passover happens. Now, when you get to Passover, it's all about this lamb. So each household needs to find a lamb without defect, and it gets slaughtered at twilight. Now, unfortunately, twilight has become a loaded word. I don't know if vampires are werewolves. It's the time of day. But now you have instructions that they were supposed to take a lamb and slaughter it at a very specific time, and I will touch upon that later. Now, what happens is you take the blood from this lamb and you put it on the door, right, on the tops and the sides of the door frame. Kind of gross, right? Like, think about it. Like, you wouldn't do this at your apartment, would you? Like, blood on the door. Like, what would your neighbors think? Especially, like, what would it smell like? I don't know. But anyway, this is what they were supposed to do. Blood on the tops and the sides of the door frame. And this was the mark. This was the sign so that they would be passed over. Anyway, continuing. And they're also told to eat in haste. Right? They're told to keep your cloak tucked in and your sandals on and your staff at your hand. Basically, you're ready to go. Right? This is not a leisurely like feast. You're not supposed to just be lounging like, American Thanksgiving, my favorite holiday. Right? What do you do after you eat? You lie on the couch and you basically fall asleep watching football. Like that to me is like the perfect holiday. But anyway, here, that is not Passover. Passover is you are ready. You are ready to go. Because God is preparing you to go. So you eat it in haste. They even, you didn't have time to put yeast in the dough, so you have these crackers instead of bread. Right? That's what unleavened bread is. It's basically unrisen bread. It tastes like a cracker. Eat it in haste. Now this is what the Passover meal looks like. So this is the unleavened bread, what we know as matzah, right? Basically big crackers. This is the like a lamb, like a shank of lamb, so you keep it on the bone. Like these are some of the bitter herbs, and then this is actually like some type of apple mixture. This is like the one sweet thing in the dish, and then there's an egg that's supposed to represent like a sacrifice to like at the temple or something like that. So this is your Passover meal, right? You have your bitter herbs, and they say so. First off, the unleavened bread is unleavened because it's supposed to signify that there was no time, right, to find leaven. There was no time to prepare proper bread. It's to remind you that this is about readiness. Now the bitter herbs, a lot of people say the bitter herbs are supposed to remind the Israelites about their bitter hardships that they faced in Egypt, right? That they face a bitterness. I don't know. The Bible doesn't necessarily say that. Maybe God just has a good palate. He's like, bitter goes well with lamb. I don't know. but this is your Passover meal, and even each part of the meal is supposed to signify different things to remind you. Now that word in the middle there is actually Pesach. Right? Pesach is the word for Passover that is in the Bible. What I found interesting thing here is there's a lot of confusion over how this word came to become Passover. Some people think it comes from the root of a verb that means to save or protect. And then I found this one kind of funny, is that some people actually think it's a more archaic word that means to limp or dance with limping motions. so I don't know. To me, that just kind of cracks me up. So my imagery, again, I have a weird spiritual imagination. It's like you're having this Passover festival, and like, all right, guys, let's do the Passover dance. I don't know. Okay, sorry. So regardless, the Passover, it has, it's come to mean like the passing over that God did when judgment was brought in Egypt. And that comes from the actual story. Now, the verb pasach that is used has been translated to passed over, skipped over, or had pity. Right? So basically, regardless of what its old etymology might have been, what we translate this now is what we see it as, Passover, or passed over. And we see in the story that this destroyer that was sent passed over everyone that had the blood on their door frames. Now the other thing that the passage really focuses on is yeast has to be removed, right? Yeast in Hebrew is chametz, right? So yeast, like basically the very first day of Passover, everyone is like running around the house, like looking for yeast to throw out. I don't know why. Like people just have yeast lying around. I don't know why, but like it's like a big ordeal that in Israel you go through the entire house and make sure there's not a single. I can't even say piece. Like yeast is like a bacteria. So what is that? But like you get rid of it, right? And it's gone for 7 entire days. And during that time, you only eat unleavened bread. I'll touch back on the meaning of that later. And what God says is this is to be a lasting ordinance. Now, like what I said last chapter, he talked about for the generations, for your children and your grandchildren. Here it's like, this is forever. Right? This is something that is supposed to be observed forever for every Israelite to remember what God did. This is a lasting ordinance for all generations. Now, we might touch upon this later, but there are 3 big festivals for every Hebrew. It's Passover, Pesach, the Feast of Weeks, Shavuot, which I talked about a long time ago during Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles. And so you'll find out later in the book of Exodus that God makes it so that every Israelite has to come back to Jerusalem to celebrate these holidays. And so these are what is called the pilgrimage festivals, meaning that even if you are a Jew that lives outside of Israel, you're supposed to come back to Jerusalem to observe these 3 holidays. And Passover is the very first one. So brothers and sisters, what I really want to stress from this is that this is the most important holiday for Israelites. The most. And there's a significant meaning behind it. Now, how did they respond after Moses and Aaron tell them this? They worshiped God and they obeyed. They did everything exactly as they were instructed. Now, granted, they had just witnessed 9 crazy plagues. And they had seen God do some crazy, crazy things. And so, before all this, they were complaining a lot to Moses. Now, they kept their mouth shut and they did everything he said. Right? But this is how they responded. After given these instructions, first they acknowledged God and they worshipped Him, and then they obeyed to the very letter. Now, as this happens, after they slaughter their lambs and they put the blood on the doorpost, judgment comes. And the firstborn of Egypt are all struck down. And it goes from Pharaoh to the man in the jail, all the way to the livestock. Remember I talked about how last week I just have this imagery of a mommy and daddy cow kind of looking sad while their baby cow is passed out. But anyway, so this happened across all of Egypt. No one was spared. And finally Pharaoh responds, and he calls Moses and Aaron. He's like, "Get out of here. Leave. Go do what you said. Go worship the Lord, just as you asked. Take everybody. Take your flocks. Take your herds." And then interestingly, he says, "And also bless me." I find that very interesting. Because all throughout these plagues, Pharaoh is often asking Moses to pray for him. Right? It's kind of interesting. Pray for me, bless me. Kind of ironic, in my opinion. But regardless, this is the last straw. All these other things that have happened, Pharaoh's heart was hardened. But here on this very last one, he finally lets them do what they asked. And he lets them leave. This, brothers and sisters, this is the Exodus. This is what allows them to finally leave Egypt. And then interestingly, as I mentioned last week, before they leave, they're like, "Hey, by the way, give me some gold and silver." Right? They go to their neighbors, "Bye. Hey, you got any gold and silver?" And they just hand it to them, right? And like I said, I imagine they're not just walking out of Israel all kind of downtrodden. They're all blinged out. They're strutting around. They got gold chain. They got like silver on their back, and they got new clothes, right? So it's a weird imagery. But basically what it's saying is that they're leaving with more than they ever had. And as we see in the stories that continue in the wilderness, they have gold to make idols. This is a rich people all of a sudden. So it's interesting. God doesn't just give them freedom, He blesses them in abundance. So when we look at the passage and we look specifically who left. Now the passage says there are about 600,000 men. That doesn't include the women and children. So a lot of people estimate it would probably be about 2 million Israelites when you include women and children. That's a very large gathering of people, right? Last I checked, the city of Incheon is about 2.7 million. So it's almost the entire city of Incheon walking outside of Egypt into the wilderness, right? But interestingly enough, in verse 38, it actually says, "many other people." What does that mean? That means the Israelites were not alone. There were foreigners with them. If you look just further, it talks about instructions for Passover for foreigners. The reason why is because they were with them. I don't think people really think about this, but the Israelites were not alone. They were never alone. Other people followed them. The reason why is because they saw that the God of Israel was real. And they went with them. And when we look throughout the law, when God talks about what the law is and what it means to be the people of God, there are always ways for foreigners to become part of that, to become part of that, to be part of the people of God. Being a Jew is not about blood. It's about faith. It's about who you believe in. So if you say, okay, I believe in the God of Israel, and you get circumcised, which if you do that as an adult is not a fun thing, you become a Jew. And if you really think about it, even in the history of the bloodline of Jesus Christ, there are two foreigners, and they're both female. Rahab the prostitute, during the Battle of Jericho. You have Ruth, right? These are two foreigners, two females that are in the very bloodline of Jesus. So brothers and sisters, being a Jew is not about ethnic purity. It is about faith. It is about who you believe in. So the outsider can even come in. And so even in this time of Exodus, the Israelites were not alone. Many other people left with them. Now what it also tells us is they had a lot of livestock, they took the dough, and they were there for 430 years. And this is significant because when you look back in the book of Genesis, God said that he would free them in 400 years. So God kept his promise. So these are the people that have left, that are part of this Exodus. About 2 million Israelites, some foreigners, a lot of animals, a lot of dough. And they do this all because they're part of God's promise. So as the passage finishes out, it gives instructions on what about foreigners? What about like foreign slaves or just random people that show up? They're not supposed to take part of the Passover unless they become circumcised, which means if they become Jews by faith, then they can be part of our party. So what that is telling us is, brothers and sisters, the festival was for the people of the promise. To be a people of the promise had nothing to do with blood. It had to be about making the commitment, the covenant, of being part of the people of God. So the question I want to ask you, I really want you to think about is, what saved the Israelites? Was it just because, they were born as an Israelite, and they woke up one day, they're like, oh, it's hard being in Egypt, and then all of a sudden, like, hey, we can go. Yay! Were they saved because of anything that they did? Think about that. Now, going more broadly, the image of a festival and a banquet goes throughout the entire Bible. This is the very first festival that's mentioned in the Bible, but this is an imagery that continues throughout it. And the banquet imagery has always been tied to salvation. And more specifically, the image shifts. And it's not just a regular banquet, it becomes a wedding banquet, right? And when you really go throughout the entire Bible and you start to understand that there's this imagery of this banquet, this festival, this celebration, and it's tied to our salvation, you find out that it's a wedding between Jesus and the church. The church is the bride. Jesus is the groom. There's a big wedding. So it's kind of weird. As part of the church, we're getting married to Jesus, but we're also part of the banquet. But that's the image that we're shown, is that this is a tremendous celebration that is open to all who become part of the people of promise. Now, I don't know about you, but I've gone to way too many weddings in my lifetime. So I guess in my jaded state of mind, wedding banquets are not that fun. But normally, this is a great, joyous occasion, right? Like for me, so it's funny because I serve at this church. There are weddings, basically, usually 2 weddings every Saturday at this church, almost throughout the year, right? And because I work at this church, I can actually go to the wedding banquet and eat every Saturday if I wanted to. I just have to tell them I'm a pastor. I can go dressed like this and just eat at a lot of our pastors do this. And our brother Sangwon, when he found out about this, he's like, you have the greatest job ever.
And I never go. Because one of the reasons why is because we use the same caterer for every single event that we do at this church. It's called Hansol, right? I joke that it's 항상 Hansol, right? It's always Hansol. So I don't really care about it. Like, I got sick of it a long time ago, so I don't go. But regardless, why did I even get into that? Wedding banquets. These are normally great celebrations. And this is what the Bible is pointing us towards, is that we are headed toward the greatest wedding banquet or feast ever. Now, interestingly, as we've been going through the Gospel of John, Apostle John has structured his gospel around 3 different festivals. And these are festivals in which Jesus goes to Jerusalem. And in many of these situations, he ends up getting into very big confrontations and actually endangers his life. And so the first one happens at the Feast of Tabernacles. The second one is the Feast of Dedication, also known as Hanukkah. And lastly, we know that Jesus ends up in Jerusalem at Passover. And that is where he ultimately dies on the cross. So there are 3 festivals that are highlighted in the Gospel of John. And they're part of Jesus' ministry. And kind of are these big turning points in what happens in his story. And as we studied the book of Hebrews last year, what we also saw is that there's a reason why blood is shed. And Hebrews 9:22 tells us that forgiveness of sins only happens when blood is shed. The cost of sin is blood. That's what Hebrews 9 tells us very specifically. And it talks about the blood of Jesus, but very specifically it tells us all sin requires the shedding of blood. So brothers and sisters, when I asked you that question, what saved the Israelites? It was the blood of the Lamb. The reason why the Lamb is so significant in this text is because that is what is known as the atoning sacrifice. It is the sacrifice of the blood that keeps the Israelites from facing the same judgment as the Egyptians. If the Israelites had just ignored Moses and said, you know what, you're crazy, like why would we put blood on our door? Forget you, and just did their own thing, they would have lost their firstborn just like the Egyptians. Now in the past, God had spared them. He had made a distinction between the Egyptians and the Israelites and not made them go through all the different plagues. But here, if they did not obey, then they would have suffered the same punishment as the Egyptians. So brothers and sisters, what I want you to really understand from this story is the blood of the Lamb is what saved them. The blood of the Lamb. And what I really want you to understand today is the blood of the greater Lamb is what saves us today. The reason why I see the significance of this chapter is this is the chapter that ties so directly to Jesus Christ. That's the reason why we sang praise songs about Jesus Christ, because this chapter, this event, the Passover, it's all about what was to come later. Okay? The blood of the Lamb saves us, continues to save us today. Now here we get into it. So Jesus, later on in the Gospels, he comes and he goes into Jerusalem, and then they're about to celebrate Passover, and he transforms it and makes it into something different. Something we call today the Lord's Supper or communion. Right? You know, the bread and the wine. This happened right around when Passover was happening. And this is the reason why, as Christians, we don't celebrate Passover anymore. Because Jesus gave us a new one. We have the Lord's Supper or communion, or it's also known as the Eucharist. This is what we celebrate as Christians because it has transformed what Passover meant into something even greater. And it's not even something that, like, Passover you celebrate once a year. Communion, how many times do we do it here? You know, once a month. Honestly, I toy with the idea of what if we did it every week, because that's what the early church did. The early church, every single Sunday, was communion. It was a celebration. It was a reminder of what had happened through Jesus Christ on the cross. Jesus transformed Passover into the communion. Now Jesus is very clearly known as the Lamb of God. John the Baptist himself declares that in John chapter 1. In Revelation 5, the Lamb enters into the throne room and continues throughout the book of Revelation.
Isaiah 53, in the sermon song, it talks about how like it will be like a lamb led to the slaughter. Jeremiah 11 echoes that same statement. There have been prophecies again and again and proclamations that Jesus is the Lamb of God. Now the other thing, what was the point of chasing out that yeast? Throughout the Bible, yeast has always been tied to sin or corruption. And so what that shows us in that Passover festival, where they're chasing out the yeast, they are trying to remove sin. And so we see that also Passover is tied to the removal of sin. Now the passage talked about how the lamb was slaughtered at twilight. If you actually look at when Jesus died on the cross, he died at the same moment when the Passover lamb was slain. You actually go back and you calculate it. When this is proclaimed, you slaughter the lamb then. On the cross, Jesus died at that very moment that the lamb was slaughtered. And lastly, it seemed like it was in passing, but in verse 46, it said, do not break any of the bones. Do you guys remember the story of Jesus on the cross? What were they going to do? They were going to break his bones because they were trying to hurry the death process. But before they could break his bones, he was already dead. So what that highlights was Jesus' bones were never broken, just as this verse talks about. In the Passover lamb, you don't break any of the bones. Just as Jesus, as the ultimate Passover lamb, none of his bones are broken. Brothers and sisters, this chapter just completely connects with the story of the cross. Jesus is the Passover lamb. This is something that the Jews would celebrate every single year after this. But ultimately, it would only need to happen one more time. And that would happen through Jesus on the cross. He is the Lamb of God. He is the one who removes the sin from our lives. He is the one that breaks that bondage of sin over our lives. And just as the passage eerily says, he died at twilight. None of his bones are broken. Now, brothers and sisters, when I go through the class on Christ in the Old Testament, we'll see other connections like that are throughout the Old Testament. This is just one example. But it's kind of crazy. You're like, what? I thought this was just a festival or a feast. How does this got to do with Jesus? It has everything to do with it. Now, this is a random aside, because a lot of people might ask the question, should we use unleavened bread at communion? Because there's a lot of confusion. Did Jesus use unleavened bread at the Lord's Supper? No one knows, honestly. And so you can go to some churches, and for communion, you get a cracker, right? There are some churches I've gone to that do that. Our church, we give, in here, pound cake. At the main church, castanella, right? so you get sugary cake at this church. But a lot of people ask this question, for the Lord's Supper, should we follow this tradition that's from the Passover? And all I can say is that when you look at the Greek of the Lord's Supper, it's just the word bread. There's a different word for unleavened bread that's not used. And ultimately, the passage never specifies. So what most church scholars and pastors have said is, you know what? It doesn't matter. If anything, it's supposed to be whatever's common. Because it's more of a reminder of something that's used on a normal basis. And so what I would say is, it doesn't matter. If you want to make unleavened bread, sure, go ahead. It's crunchy. But if not, it's fine. Some people even say, we need to contextualize the communion. Instead of bread and wine, we should use Cheetos and cola. I don't know. Regardless, this is not significant. But I want us to remember that the blood of the Lamb is what saves us today. That blood that was shed on the cross continues to save us, continues to wash us anew, continues to remove the sin in our lives. And so what we are looking at in Exodus is what is called the first Exodus. Moses led the Israelites outside of a physical slavery to the Egyptians that they were under for 430 years. What I really want you to understand, what's significant to us today, is that Jesus leads the second Exodus. He leads us outside of the physical slavery of sin. And this is something that is continuing to this day. As people are saved, as people receive the gospel, as people come to know Jesus as their Lord and Savior, they are being part of this second Exodus. Brothers and sisters, this is the whole reason why we've been building up this entire story and understanding what is going on, is to understand that this is the real, this is what's happening now. This is the past, right? And it's important for us to learn from the past. But brothers and sisters, this is what is happening now. Jesus continues to lead the second Exodus. So just as we remember that the blood of the Lamb saved the Israelites back then, as they obeyed, as they put the blood on the doorpost, it saved them back then. Just to reiterate, it is the blood of the Lamb that continues to save us today. What I really want you to understand is focus on this. Focus on Jesus. Embrace Him and be free. Right? Doesn't have to be an actual physical pharaoh. Doesn't have to be physical slavery. Some of you might be experiencing that. Right? Maybe it's a spiritual bondage that you're under. Maybe it's like a more mental issue that you are struggling with, an emotional issue. Whatever it is, what I want you to understand is that when you hold on to Jesus, as He leads you through the second Exodus, you can be free. Embrace Him and be free. And at the end of the day, it's party time. Let's be part of this festival. Let's be part of this banquet. And even when we do communion, this is the reason why I focus on celebration. It's because it's a reminder that we have victory in Jesus. And that there's so much to look forward to. So let's have that mentality. We have been saved. We are free. So let's celebrate Jesus. This is when I pray. I'll close this for today. I want you to just take a moment to just focus on Jesus as the Lamb. And how Jesus died on the cross in our place. I just want you to take a moment to just thank Him for that, and to dwell on that, and to just know that as truth, and to allow that to speak to you right now. So let's just take a moment to reflect on Jesus as our Lamb, Jesus as a sacrifice in our place. Let's pray.